Hi, this is Adam Vascal, and today's video is all about openings. In my opinion, the most important part of the presentation. And finding something that opens with is super important, but it's not that difficult if you get used to it. So we'll talk about that today. But a quick story: was traveling around with my old company and doing a lot of presentations on the road. And my boss, there's one opening that I used. My boss absolutely hated, so I didn't do it for a while. But then I tried it later on just to see how it would go. It was a big success and a big hit. So it was a bit of a risk for me to go ahead and do that anyway, even though I was told not to, but it worked out really well. So what I did is I had the audience, I would say, okay, if your birthday is between January and April, I want you to put your hands in the shape of a Y. So basically I had them all stand up first. And then if you are May through July, I want you to put your hands kind of in a shape like this, like a triangle, and just put your fingers together. And then if you are everyone else, then I want you to do the same thing, but try to connect your elbows if you can. So you're kind of making this shape. So what we did is we had everybody stand up and everybody make these designs with their hands, and of course they don't know what's going on. And you draw it out and you make them stand there for a minute, say, hey, okay, hang on one second, I want to take a picture. You take pictures, and then said, okay, thanks a lot, made them sit down, and then acted like I was going to go into my presentation without really explaining what was going on. And then I stopped myself short and said, okay, you may have been wondering why I made you do that. And the reason is my boss said that I could not get a standing ovation at this presentation. So now I have proof and I have pictures to prove it. And so I'll show her when I get back. So usually you'll get some groans from that, but most people will really appreciate it. And I heard a lot of people later on, it's like, yeah, I appreciate you helping us to stand up. It works particularly well if you have other presenters in front of you, especially if they might be boring, where they are just sitting there and dying and they've been sitting for hours or maybe hours on end. It's really good to get them up, get the blood flowing, and even if you get a few groans, it's completely okay. They appreciate just having something a little bit different, a little bit outside of the box. So here's a picture from that presentation. Looks like I had a fist pump included in the available options, but it worked really well to get everybody up and listening and ready to go for the presentation. So for today's video, we're going to talk about hobbies, passions, and strategy when it comes to presenting and making a really effective opening. It should be easy, honestly, and we'll talk about why that's the case, and preferably it is easy for you, but we're going to talk again about hobbies, passions, and strategy. So we'll start with hobbies. For me, one hobby I have that works really well with my presentations is I think history is really interesting. I read about it, I watch YouTube about it. But I do think studying history is really interesting, and there's a lot of stories out there that people may or may not know. It actually works really well if people do know the story that you're telling because they connect to it instantly. So don't be afraid of that if it's something that you feel like everyone knows or everyone studied in history. For example, one thing I always think that's an interesting joke is telling people like who invented the cotton gin. And it seems like everybody, maybe that's just a Southern thing, but everybody seems to know it's Eli Whitney. So I always kind of make a joke that it's like there's all these things that we could know that are super important for our lives, but we all seem to know Eli Whitney for some reason. But it's sometimes it's easy to make references like that where people are like, yeah, that's a really odd thing to study in school and make sure we understand who invented the cotton gin. But for me, if it's reading, I think it's really interesting to talk about things that you are reading. Some books that I've got. This is The House of Morgan. It's about J.P. Morgan and the rise of their family. I have this book about Genghis Khan that I've used. I have. I'll talk about this later on. But economics. Read lots of stuff. This is Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. It's an awesome book. And then one I've used quite a bit is Fortune's Children. I live in the Nashville area in Franklin, Tennessee, and this talks about the Vanderbilt family. So it's a really, especially I'm doing something local, it's a really good story to talk about. And it talks about the rise and the fall of the Vanderbilt family. And of course, it works really well when you're talking about New York because that's where they built their empire. If you've ever been to the Biltmore in Asheville, if you're in the North Carolina area. So things like that work really well. But I'll give you an example. So there's a story about the Commodore Vanderbilt and how he built his fortune. And he started just ferrying people in New York. And he built that by basically borrowing a little bit of money from his mom. And suddenly he grew that empire into into trains, and it just kind of went from there. But he had this huge fleet, but he decided, this is do I just sit on my empire that I've created in the shipping industry, or do I switch over to railways? And so it was a really tough decision for him. So I think with that in mind, the only connection you're trying to make is that he had to make a tough decision, and that can be applied to just about anything you're presenting on. So if you are talking about, a lot of my presentations were on the investment world, it's really easy to talk about, for seniors, like, they have a lot of really difficult decisions. Do they stay conservative where they now struggle with inflation, or do they make that decision to be more aggressive and try to keep up with inflation, and historically know over time that the market does well and that they're going to grow their assets? So but of course you've got a year like this year, which is 2022, where the market has been terrible, and it's really difficult for them to say, I should have been more conservative. So a lot of times it's really easy to make intros like that if you can just come up with the overall theme of what you read. But the thing is, don't worry so much about what your hobbies are, but try to incorporate them into your presentations. So the second part of our presentation is on using your passions in your openings. So one of mine is economics. I have a degree in economics. I taught here in Nashville at Belmont University for a while, and I think it's really interesting. Now, the reason I use it as an example here is that not everybody finds economics interesting. I would say maybe even most people don't. If you ask someone if they took economics in college, they may not have enjoyed it, and I think that's very common. But what the point I'm trying to make here is that if you find something interesting and you're very passionate about it, that will show when you're presenting. And so even though you might only connect with a few people on the subject matter, you're going to likely connect with everyone on your passion, because everyone has some sort of something interesting that they're into that maybe not everybody else is. And they might be interested in learning something that you do, just because you're going to go down that rabbit hole a little bit. So with this one, I'll give you a presentation that I've used quite a bit that is 100% not in everyone's wheelhouse, but has worked well because I have interest in it. So this is, the reason I want to bring this up is this, I want to talk about Arthur Laffer. And does anybody know who Arthur Laffer is? He was an economist under Reagan, and he's famous for the Laffer curve, which is essentially this little drawing that I have here. And it's going to be a comparison of tax rates and tax revenue. So we're basically going to show the relationship between what the government can tax versus what they actually collect from their citizens. And theoretically speaking, you can go anywhere between a 0% tax rate and 100%, right? So 0%, assuming that if we tax at 0%, then the government would collect nothing in revenue, right? So we're going to start here at this bottom corner. But what do you think the government collects if they tax 100%? So initially, I would have thought that if it's 100%, that that's going to be the most they could possibly collect. But Laffer said basically the opposite. And if you tax at 100%, he said that you have the same outcome. There would be no tax revenue because the people wouldn't work. So if your outcome is the same whether you work or not in terms of what you take home to support your family, then you're not going to work in that situation. So the outcome of this is basically a curve, the Laffer curve, that looks something like this. And what you're trying to look for as a government is this item here, where you're going to maximize tax revenue by charging that perfect tax rate that gives you that maximum tax revenue. So kind of interesting from that standpoint, where if you think about all of the work that the government puts into trying to pull the most they possibly can in taxes from their citizens, then it's probably worth your while to spend a little time figuring out how to protect your assets from taxation. All right, so we've talked about hobbies, we've talked about passions, and this is last step, we're going to talk about strategy. Now, strategy for an opening, I think it's only fair to keep in mind that you're probably going to be pretty nervous when you start a presentation, and that's only fair, especially if you haven't done very many. And honestly speaking, I mean, every time that I would get up in front of a new audience of people I did not know, it's always nerve-wracking. So I think the opening, one of the best things you can do with an opening is make it easy on yourself. Have an opening that's fun, that you enjoy telling, that you can't forget. just because it's something that's so ingrained and something that you enjoy so much that it's really impossible for you to forget the content. Again, I'm not a big fan of scripting out my presentations. And so really it's just you up in front of a group of people talking about something that you enjoy. And that makes it a lot easier. It gives you a minute for the nerves to calm down. Again, it's really hard to forget. Another kind of a bonus item to speak on when it comes to passions is family. I love talking about family when I'm opening because, again, I'm not going to forget a story about my grandparents. Another opening that I use quite a bit is talking about how my grandparents on my dad's side came over from Hungary. It's an amazing escape from the Soviet army and smuggled across into Austria, and it's just an awesome story. And it's something I can't forget. I enjoy telling that story. And so when I'm in front of a group and I'm super nervous and I want to make a good first impression and get the presentation off to a good start, that's another one that's really great to lead with. So think about your family as well, and you could group that into your passions category. So when it comes to strategy, think about something that you enjoy working, that you enjoy telling, that calms your nerves. If you're a joke teller, I would say that can work. I've seen that done. If you're not naturally funny, then don't do it. Think about something that, again, that you feel is going to work well for you and is a passion. So thinking about these things, we got number one is going to be hobbies, passions. And then as a strategy, please lean on these things in your family when you're opening up a presentation, because that's going to make your opening so much better. And then you'll get better at tying it into the content. It's amazing how with a little practice, no matter what the opening is, you can almost always find a way to tie it into your content and then refer back to your opening throughout your presentation. So we'll talk about that stuff a little bit later on as well. But let me know what openings that you have used. I'd really be interested in knowing how you've opened a presentation. Please stay away from today's presentation is about this, so let's get into it. I don't like that kind of opening. I just don't think that's particularly interesting, and most people are like, oh, okay, well, yeah, let's get this over with. That's the feel that I get from that. So take a second, come up with an opening that's interesting, and your presentation will be all the better for it.